So knowledge is defined as true justified belief. And within the realm of things that we would consider as true justified beliefs, we can talk about inferential and non-inferential knowledge. Non-inferential knowledge is knowledge that is known in a direct way, whereas inferential knowledge is knowledge that is reached by reasoning from other prior statements. Possible sources of non-inferential knowledge include direct sense experience and self-evident statements. And then some people argue that there's a third form of non-inferential knowledge that we can have through personal intuition, but that's controversial. Now, direct sense experience includes things like knowing what peanut butter tastes like, knowing what it's like to burn a finger, recognizing the sound of your doorbell. Basically, when we're talking about direct experience, we're talking about the sorts of things that you can know either through your five senses or just through sensations from your body. So we'd include within direct experience things like the feeling of having a stomach ache or the feeling of having a headache. Basically anything that you can feel directly with your body or sense directly with your senses. Now, by self-evident statements, we mean statements that can be known solely by virtue of the meaning of the words in them. Some examples of self-evident statements on this understanding would be the classic, all bachelors are unmarried males. If it is raining on the quad, it is raining on the quad, and no bachelors are female. Now notice that all three of these sentences can be known to be true simply by virtue of knowing the definitions of all the words in them. So if you know what bachelor means in English, you know that all bachelors are unmarried males, simply by virtue of the meaning of the words in them. Similarly, every green table is green. If you know that basically any sentence of this form is going to be self-evident. Every green table is green. Every pink table is pink. Every purple elephant is purple, and so forth. Now here by self-evident, we're using the word self-evident to mean something a little bit narrower than it's often used in ordinary usage. In ordinary usage, we often say that something is self-evident just in case it's obviously true. But that's not exactly how we're using it here. There's a number of statements that are obviously true that we wouldn't say are self-evident in this sense because they don't follow purely from the meaning of the words in the sentence. So for instance, it's obviously true that there are more than 3 dogs in the U.S., that it would hurt if a cinder block fell on your foot, or that candy is not nutritious. But none of these are self-evident in the sense of being non-inferential knowledge, because all of these we know through some form of inference. So basically, the reason we know that there are more than 3 dogs in the U.S. is that we're making some kind of inference from our general experience with dogs in the U.S. Given the number of dogs we've seen in our daily lives in the U.S., we can safely assume that right now there's more than 3 of them around. Similarly, given our experience with the weight of cinder blocks and our general experience with dropping things on our feet, we can infer that it would hurt if a cinder block fell on your foot. Given what we know about candy and what we know about what is and isn't nutritious, we know that candy is not nutritious. So none of these are self-evident in the sense of being non-inferential because all of them follow from inferences. Really simple, practically unconscious inferences, but inferences nonetheless. Now, so we said that on our definition of self-evident, a self-evident statement is one that is true by virtue of the meanings of the words in it. Now, a subset of self-evident statements are true by virtue not of the meaning of all the words in the sentence, but just by the virtue of the meaning of a few keywords. And we call these logical truths. Now, one of the logical truths was already in our list of self-evident statements. If it's raining on the quad, then it's raining on the quad. Now notice that this is true by virtue of the meanings in it, but specifically it's true by virtue of the meanings of the words in black, if and then. So, and really, whatever, you could put in any sentence for it is raining on the quad, and the sentence would still remain self-evidently true just by virtue of the meanings of the words if and then and the construction of the sentence. So if squirrels are mammals, then squirrels are mammals. If candy is bad for you, then candy is bad for you. Now we say that logical truths are true by virtue of their logical form. So the if-then form is one of those logical forms. That is the if-then form with the same sentence repeated twice. So if candy is bad for you, then candy is bad for you. Always going to be self-evidently true on our definition. Another common logical truth is of the form either it is true that the world will end tomorrow or it is not true that the world will end tomorrow. It is not the case that it is both true that squirrels are mammals and false that squirrels are mammals. So it's not true that squirrels are mammals and false that squirrels are mammals. It's one or the other. So now these are three logical forms, and sometimes it's helpful to look at these logical forms in a more schematic form. So for instance, the first one is of the form if A, then A. Anything you stick in for that A, any statement or proposition with a possible truth value that you stick in for A is going to make that sentence true. I realize it's never going to be an exciting sentence, but it's still going to be a true sentence. Similarly, anything you stick in for B, and either it's true that B or it's not true that B, is going to end up being true. And the second one is such a common form for logical truths that we've given it a name. Logic people have given it a name. It's called the law of excluded middle. And similarly, the rule at the bottom, it is not the case that it is both true that C and false that C, is called the law of non-contradiction. Now, when I say that the law of excluded middle is a law of logic and the law of non-contradiction is a law of logic, I seem to be saying that there are no exceptions to the rule. And certainly for the law of non-contradiction, most logicians would argue that there aren't any exceptions to the rule. It's just a basic law of logic that it's not the case that it's both true and false, that any statement is both true and false. Now there's a number of common objections that people raise to the idea of there being laws to logic. And in addressing these objections, it's important to understand exactly what we mean when we say these are logical laws. There are a couple important limits to the idea of logical form here. One is, and it's probably the most important limit, is that it's being assumed when we say that statements of these forms are always true, that the meanings of the words in the sentence are being used consistently. So whatever sentence you put in for C in the law of non-contradiction is going to have to mean exactly the same thing in the first appearance as it does in the second appearance in the sentence. So sometimes you get people saying, well, the law of non-contradiction isn't true. Look, this is a way of disproving the law of contradiction. It is true that it is true that it is raining, and it is false that it is raining. And the reason why it's true that it's raining and it's false that it's raining is that it's true that it's raining here in Hays, Kansas, and false that it's raining in the Sahara Desert. This is to simply misunderstand what we're getting at with the law of non-contradiction. Notice that when we say it's true that it's raining and false that it's raining and intend it to be, and intend that as a true sentence, we're not using the sentence, it is raining, consistently in both appearances. In the first appearance, we're using it to mean it is raining in Hays, and in the second appearance, we're using it to mean it is raining in the Sahara Desert. So the law of non-contradiction only holds when you're using when you're holding the meaning of the component sentences that fill in those C spots consistently. Now, in general, the law of non-contradiction is seen as as more broadly applicable than the law of excluded middle. And this is for the very simple reason that there seem to be plenty of cases in which there are statements that don't necessarily have a truth value one way or another. So for instance, when I say either it is true that Zillig is Zophar or it is not true that Zillig is Zophar, I'm not really saying anything true because Zillig is Zophar doesn't have a truth value. It's just a little nonsense phrase that I made up a few seconds ago. Now, the interesting thing about this, now this raises a fairly intuitive idea, which is that not all sentences that have proper grammatical statement form actually have meaningful truth values one way or another. It's all obvious that Zillig is Zophar doesn't have a meaningful truth value one way or another, since it's nonsense. But it's interesting to note that there's a number of sentences that seem to be perfectly clear statements with perfectly clear meanings, but that in fact, upon a little bit of analysis, turn out to not be meaningful because they turn out to not be sentences that can that can have a determinate truth value. Now we'll talk about this more later in the class. If you're interested in this idea, you might want to look up something called the Barber's paradox for a simple little example of that. Okay, so now logical truths are true by virtue of logical form. And we'll want to keep in mind this idea of logical form. For in a few minutes we're going to be talking about logical form further, not just in the case of statements and sentences, but in the case of entire arguments. Now I said that there was a third possible candidate for being non-inferential knowledge, and this is personal intuition. So personal intuition would include claims of knowledge such as, I just know that fellow is up to no good, or I can just sense that it's about to rain, or I can feel that something is wrong with my spouse. When considering the question of whether statements like this are a special third kind of non-inferential knowledge, the question to take up isn't so much, well, when people say these, do they really know these things, or are they just fooling themselves? The more important question, I think, is when people say these things, even if they're correct, and even if they're talking about knowledge, that is, even if you really can sense that something is wrong with your spouse, when something is wrong with your spouse, and there's no obvious statement that you're inferring it from, it's not necessarily the case that you know that by virtue of something other than either inference or observation. So for instance, you might be able to tell when something is wrong with your spouse because there's something about your spouse's body language, or something about the facial expression in your spouse that's very subtle that no one else would notice, and it's so subtle that you might not even consciously notice it, but yet that you can detect, and that tells you that something is wrong, that your spouse is unhappy or dissatisfied or worried about something. I think this is very plausible, and so it's important to note that when we talk about personal intuition, you can call that personal intuition, but as long as it's ultimately based on sense experience, as would be the case if you were really detecting something about your spouse's face, then it's not a unique non-inferential form of knowledge. Okay? So critics of personal intuition aren't so much critics of statements like, I know that I can just sense that there's something wrong with my spouse, or I can sense that it's about to rain, so much as they're critics of the notion that this indicates some sort of special ability or special sense beyond what's included in direct sense experience and inference. All right, So those are our three types of non-inferential knowledge. Now we'll move on to talking about types of inferential knowledge. Now remember that inferential knowledge is knowledge that we come to through inference, hence the name, from other prior statements. So anytime you have a piece of knowledge, anytime you know something that you've inferred, there are other prior statements that you've inferred that knowledge from. And if you've inferred that knowledge from other prior statements, it's always possible to write down those prior statements and write down what you've inferred. And when you do that, you've got the premises and conclusion of an argument. So when we talk about inferential knowledge, we can also talk about related inferential arguments. So anytime you have an inference, you can sort of write down that inference, write down the prior statements and the conclusion, and you've got an argument. And you can analyze that argument, you can analyze the form of that argument. And in doing so, you're substantially analyzing the form of your inference. And we can talk about better and worse inferences in terms of better and worse argument forms. Now there's two broad categories of argument: non-deductive and deductive arguments. So non-deductive arguments include inductive and abductive reasoning. And inductive and abductive reasoning at most establish a probable connection between the prior statements that we're concerned with and the conclusion that we're hoping to be knowledge, that we're hoping to be a justified belief. Whereas a deductive argument requires a valid argument form. So here we're using valid in a very specific sense. We're using valid in the sense of deductive validity, where validity, deductive validity, is a component or a property of arguments. And specifically, it's a property of the logical form of an argument. Now, an argument that is deductively valid has the property that by virtue of its logical form, it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. It's important to note here that it is possible for a deductively valid argument to have false premises and a false conclusion, or false premises, or one false premise and a false conclusion, or a false premise and a true conclusion. What a deductive argument, the one situation that can't hold if you have a deductively valid argument, is true premises and a false conclusion. So if you have a deductively valid argument, and you can recognize it as deductively valid, and you have good reason to believe that the conclusion is false, then you also have good reason to believe that one of the premises is false. And it just takes one. So you can have a 20 premise argument. And if a single one of a 20 premise deductive argument, and if a single one of those premises is false, then the conclusion may be false. Okay, I've been doing some hand waving about logical form of deductive arguments. Let's talk about a couple specific deductive argument forms. Now, one deductive argument form can be seen in the argument, a platypus is either a mammal or it's a bird. It isn't a bird, therefore it is a mammal. And over to the left here we have the symbolic form written out. And the way this works is similar to our discussion of the logical form of logical truths. The little letters stand for entire statements, okay? And letters consistently stand for the same statement understood in the same way. So here, if we were to really precisely read out the argument in the symbolic form, it would read either a platypus is a mammal or a platypus is a bird. It is not the case that a platypus is a bird, therefore a platypus is a mammal. The little three dots at the bottom are logic speak for therefore. All right, so this logical form is called a disjunctive syllogism. And you can see that and this particular disjunctive syllogism has true premises. Okay, so it is true that a platypus is either a mammal or a bird. It's true that a platypus isn't a mammal, at least as far as current taxonomies go. A platypus counts as a mammal rather than a bird. And therefore, so you've got true premises, a logically valid argument, a deductively logically valid argument, and therefore you have a true conclusion. Now, a deductively valid argument with true premises is called deductively sound. Okay, so this is a sound argument. In general, it's going to be much easier in life to tell whether an argument is deductively valid than to tell whether an argument is deductively sound. You can take a logic class and learn, an intro logic class, and learn most of what there is to know about evaluating whether or not an argument is deductively valid. Unfortunately, there's no single class you can take that will tell you whether statements in general are true or false. So evaluating for soundness is much more difficult than evaluating simply for validity. But further on in this class, we're going to be talking a good bit about knowing when something is true or false, or having good reasons to believe something. And so hopefully we'll be able to do a little something for you in terms of evaluating soundness for this class. But let's stay for a few more moments on deductive validity. So another very common argument form is philosophers love to give things Latin names. So this is modus ponens, also called affirming the antecedent. The terminology antecedent and consequent has to do with these if-then statements. So here in this if P then Q, P is the antecedent and Q is the consequent. So antecedent is a sort of ridiculously fancy way of saying the first term in an if-then statement, and consequent is a fancy way of saying the second term in an if-then statement. All right, so here we've got if a coin is put into the machine, a gumball will come out. A coin was put into the machine, therefore a gumball will come out. Now you can see here that you can evaluate the validity of this argument pretty clearly without having to know whether the premises are true or not. For any given gumball machine, who knows if a gumball will reliably come out when you put a coin in? Maybe you've got maybe the thing's broken, maybe you've got the wrong change, maybe it's a really expensive gumball and you need to put 3 coins in, and so forth. But you can tell that if these premises are true, by virtue of having this symbolic form, the conclusion is going to have to be true. Here's a third deductively valid form. If P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So if the baker has added the yeast, the bread has risen. The bread has not risen, therefore the baker did not add the yeast. Now this is a deductively valid argument form. Okay, if the premises of this argument are true, and sort of who knows if one is true, right, in this argument. But if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. However, this very similar looking argument form is not deductively valid. Now let's read this out. If the baker has added the yeast, the bread has risen. The bread has risen, therefore the baker has added the yeast. Now, I think that in ordinary conversation, say if you're getting to work at the bakery and you're heading back to get started to take over your shift, and you're asking about what needs to be done, and one of your coworkers says, well, if the baker's added the yeast, the bread has risen, and another one of your coworkers says, well, the bread has risen, I imagine you would agree that, well, you would probably come to the conclusion, well, yeah, the baker must have added the yeast. However, this is not a deductively valid argument. Okay? This is not a good argument form. And this really shows us why looking at the argument form in this sort of symbolic form can be useful. Because our ordinary language example, it's not obvious, it's not terribly obvious that it's a bad argument. But if we look at this form and then think about a way of making an argument with this form, which has true premises and a false conclusion, we find that It's not only possible, it's pretty easy to do. Okay, so here we go. This is the exact same argument form with true premises and a false conclusion. So if Lincoln was decapitated, then Lincoln is dead. That's true, right? As far as we know, nobody can survive being decapitated. 2, Lincoln is dead. As far as we know, Lincoln really did get shot by Booth in the Ford Theater and died. Therefore, Lincoln was decapitated. Okay, this follows this argument form, but it has a false conclusion. It's not true that Lincoln was decapitated. So this shows that this argument form, if P, then Q, Q, therefore P, is not a deductively valid argument form. And so if you have true premises in this argument form, you are not guaranteed to have a true conclusion. And this is going to be something that's going to be important that we're going to talk about as an important feature of our discussion of the scientific method. So keep in mind this idea of that affirming the consequent is not a deductively valid argument form. Okay, so now the argument forms we've been using, we've talked about so far, are argument forms where you can stick, are argument forms based on compound sentences. So sentences that have if, then, and, or connecting two complete statements. Okay. But it's not the case that all deductively valid argument forms require these compound sentences. That is, you can have some deductive argument forms that aren't necessarily made up of whole sentences stuck together by and or. And so here's a few examples on this page. For instance, no amphibians are warm-blooded. Kermit is amphibian, therefore Kermit is not warm-blooded. This is a valid, deductively valid argument form. There's no way for something having this form, no so-and-sos are such and such, A is a so-and-so, therefore A is not a such and such. I'm not going to give you the, it gets a little ornate to write out the deductive argument form here, so I'm not going to worry you with that. But it can be done. You can write out schematically argument forms for these types of statements, as well as propositional statements. But I think that just sort of looking at this argument, you can see that if no amphibians are warm-blooded and Kermit is an amphibian, it follows from what we mean by no amphibians in this context that Kermit is not warm-blooded. And then similarly, just once again, when talking about deductive validity, it's really important to emphasize that whether or not something is deductively valid is not dependent on the actual truth value of the premises. It's dependent on the logical form. And we understand the logical form in terms of this idea that it's impossible to have true premises and a false conclusion. But that doesn't mean that a deductively valid argument does have true premises or doesn't. Identifying an argument as deductively valid doesn't tell us one way or another whether the premises or conclusion are true. It tells us something about the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. So for instance, this argument, all human beings are mammals. Bill Murray is a human being, therefore Bill Murray is a mammal. That's a deductively valid argument. It's also deductively sound, unless there's something about Bill Murray that he's not telling us. But all human beings are reptiles. Bill Murray is a human being. Bill Murray is a reptile is still deductively valid. It's got exactly the same argument form. That's a deductive argument form. The relationship between the premises and the conclusion is such that if the premises were true, if we really were all reptiles, then Bill Murray would be a reptile as well, since Bill, if he was a human being. All right. So now, if you're formulating an argument, if you're arguing with someone, and you can formulate your argument such that it is deductively sound. That is, if you've got true premises and your premises are in deductive argument form, you're in good shape. That's a good thing to have. It's nice to have a deductively sound argument when you're trying to argue for some claim. When you're making an inference, it's nice to some piece of, to some belief, and your inference is based on prior statements that can be formulated into a deductive argument, and all of those prior statements are true, you're in good shape with regard to that belief. That belief probably counts as knowledge. It's probably true and justified. However, just because you don't happen to have a deductively valid argument doesn't mean that you have a bad argument. There are a number of argument forms that are good argument forms and that ought to be taken seriously that are not deductively valid. Okay? A number of good argument forms that don't that are such that the premises do not guarantee the conclusion, and yet the conclusion, given these, if you're faced with given these arguments, the conclusion might still be worth accepting. So here are a few examples of arguments that are at least not obviously immediately to be discounted by virtue of their form or content. So 100 mice have been given the drug. All of those 100 mice have gone bald. If you were to conclude that the drug causes baldness in mice, well, we'll talk about the quality of this in a minute, but it's at least not an obviously bad argument. But it's clear that the truth of the premises don't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Similarly, for the argument with the same premises but the conclusion that the 101st mouse given the drug will go bald. It may or may not be a good argument, but it clearly doesn't, it clearly is not such that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And then this I think, slightly better, longer argument. Suppose the trees on the Smith's farm are doing poorly, the trees on the Jones farm are doing poorly, the trees on the Roberts farm are doing well. The Jones and the Smiths haven't watered their trees. The Roberts have watered their trees. If you were to conclude from these 5 statements, okay, if you had these 5 bits of information, these 5 prior statements, and you inferred that watering trees helps them thrive, that's at least a plausible inference to make. Okay? That's a plausible inference to best explanation. Okay, so now these 3 arguments represent 3 fairly common forms of non-deductive inference. The one in the top left corner is an inductive generalization. The one immediately below it is an inductive analogy. And the argument about the trees, as I said, is an inference to best explanation. So let's look at these forms of argument separately. An inductive generalization derives a general claim from some number of specific claims. A good inductive generalization requires a sufficient number of individual cases. What is a sufficient number of individual cases? Well, that's the question. That's the rub. Evaluating whether an inductive generalization is a good argument or not is quite different from evaluating whether a deductive argument is valid or not valid. There's a pretty straightforward way that you can determine whether an argument is deductively valid or not. You can easily tell that an argument is deductively invalid by coming up with a counterexample. That is, a case of that argument that has 2 premises and a false conclusion, much as we did with our Lincoln example a moment ago. With inductive generalizations, though, you got to figure out whether you've got enough cases, whether those cases are relevant, and in general, even if you're pretty happy with the number of specific cases you're drawing your generalization from, and you're pretty happy with the relevance of those specific cases, it's always possible that the conclusion is false. There's nothing about the form of an inductive generalization that requires that the conclusion has to be true given that the premises are true. And this is and so the validity of inductive, not validity, I'm sorry, I promised that we were going to use validity in strictly the deductive sense, but the value of inductive generalization is a little harder, of any particular inductive generalization, is a little harder to determine. It's not always hard to determine, though. consider this very bad inductive generalization. My uncle dislikes Memorial Hospital. My cousin dislikes Memorial Hospital. Therefore, everyone dislikes Memorial Hospital. Now, hopefully you can see, just looking at this, that this is probably a bad inference. Okay? For one thing, it's drawing a general claim about everyone based on a sample of 2 people. And the sample it's drawing the generalization from isn't even a particularly diverse sample. It appears to be members of the same family. And so hopefully you can see that, you wouldn't want to say that just because your uncle disliked Memorial Hospital and your cousin disliked Memorial Hospital, that it's reasonable to infer that everyone dislikes Memorial Hospital. With Memorial, I'm not actually referring to any particular hospital there. That's is the most generic name I could think of. But before you just move on and say, well, that's a foolish sort of argument to make. That's a foolish sort of inference to make. I think if you think about it a moment, you'll realize that people make exactly this sort of inference all the time. People all the time will tell you, oh, everybody hates that restaurant, or nobody likes that hospital, or nobody approves of this particular public policy measure. And then when you ask them why they think that, by everyone they're referring to members of their own circle, and often not even very many members of their own circle. So I think it's good to keep in mind that when you're generalizing, when you're making a general claim, and you're basing it on specific pieces of information, it's important to have enough specific pieces of information, and it's important to have relevant information. And so it's actually fairly difficult, I think, to be really justified in making a general claim based on specific cases. Okay, now the Memorial, this cousin and uncle Memorial Hospital example is a pretty, hopefully I think a pretty obviously poor example of a inductive generalization. So let's go back to our bald mice examples. Now, just a little picture of this little beauty there. So remember that we had our 2 bald mice arguments, where I said one was an inductive generalization, and one was an inductive analogy. So the inductive generalization, the idea is, so you're a researcher, and you've given 100 mice this specific drug, and all of those 100 mice have gone bald. So every single one of them lost all of its hair, just like the little critter in the previous slide. Now it's at least conceivable that 100 mice would be enough, right? Particularly if there are 100 mice, if the biology of the mice was similar enough. If every one of 100 mice went bald upon giving this drug, it might be reasonable to believe that the drug causes baldness in mice. And it may not. That would be a judgment to be made by someone who's far more familiar with mice biology than I am. But now, very closely related to inductive generalization is inductive analogy. So an inductive analogy argument would be 100 mice have been given the drug. All of those 100 mice have gone bald. The 101st mouse is relevantly similar to the first 100 mice. Therefore, the 101st mouse will go bald. So now, often inductive analogy arguments like this are identified really as a sort of subspecies of inductive generalizations. Because if you look at this argument, really what's going on here is there's sort of an implicit premise between 2 and 3. There's sort of between 2 and 3 you could insert a 2.5 that says all of those 100 mice have gone bald. All relevantly similar mice will go bald. Then the third premise, the 101st mouse is relevantly similar to the first 100, therefore the 101st mouse will go bald. So inductive analogies arguments are a form of argument by analogy that that incorporate inductive generalizations into the inherent reasoning of them. Now, we'll be talking quite a bit more about inductive analogies and other forms of argument by analogy later in the course. So here we'll move on to our third and final form, the third and final form of non-deductive inference that we'll be talking about today. And this is abductive reasoning. Now, abductive reasoning is a term coined by philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, who you'll be reading later on in this class. And abductive reasoning is sort of, in a way, abductive reasoning is a sort of a higher order form of reasoning than inductive and deductive generalization, inductive and deductive reasoning, in that abductive reasoning really tends to include elements of both inductive and deductive reasoning. And two common forms of abductive reasoning, two common and frankly very closely related forms of reasoning are inference to the best explanation and scientific method. So our example of inference to the best explanation was this argument that the trees on the Smiths and Jones farms are doing poorly, the trees on the Roberts farm are doing well. The difference between the farms that are doing well and the farms that aren't doing well seem to be watering, and therefore the conclusion is reached that watering trees helps them to thrive. Okay, so this would be an inference that a good explanation for all 5 of these data points would be that watering trees helps them to thrive. And insofar as that conclusion is a good explanation for the five components, it's a good argument. Now, a very similar form of reasoning goes into reasoning in the scientific method, which will be our topic for our next lecture.